In this week's Torah reading, Parshat Ekev, we hear V'amarta bilvavcha kochi ve'otzem yadi asali et hachayil hazeh. You may say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. It's a warning to the Israelites when they enter the land and they start to settle it and they produce their produce and build their civilization, that there might come a time in the future when you're going to think that it's only because of you that you have accomplished this station in your life. And you're going to forget God's power in partnership in your well-being. So the Torah warns us that power unmoored from moral accountability has the potential to blind us. It makes us think that we alone are the source of our success, and it tempts us to believe that strength entitles us to take whatever we want. But the warning is not only about how we use power, it's also about how we display it. Strength can be eroded not just by injustice, but by arrogance, by humiliation, and mockery of others. A leader who wields power without restraint damages not only the object of that power, but also the moral core of the community that they represent. This is a very tough moment to be a Jew, a Zionist, whether in Israel or here in the diaspora. Just this week, the Israeli Security Cabinet approved taking control of Gaza City. The goal, as stated, is to dismantle Hamas's remaining military capabilities, an objective most Israelis see as necessary to prevent another October 7th. But many fear that this could deepen the humanitarian crisis and entangle Israel in an indefinite occupation. Even from inside the government, from Netanyahu's own advisors, there are voices of dissent, of warning. National Security Advisor Tzachi Hanegbi has said such a move would harm Israel's strategic position. IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir warned that it could endanger the hostages and compromise the army's integrity. Meanwhile, many humanitarian agencies continue to report of famine, mass displacement, and severe child malnutrition. Human rights organizations, including Israeli human rights organizations, for the first time, organizations like B'Tselem and Rof'im L'Zchiot Adam Yisrael, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, have issued an unprecedented accusation accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. Now, I want to be clear. From everything that I have learned and the people that I talk to, genocide is not occurring in Gaza. At the same time, there's no serious diplomat or military official that I know or have read about who believes that there is any war in which war crimes do not occur, including every single war that Israel has fought up into this one. The question isn't whether or not war crimes occur, but what does the government do about that? One of the things that's not being reported is that there are currently 4,000 investigations into the IDF, by the IDF and the Attorney General of Israel, of potential war crimes being committed by Israel. This is just the reality of life. It is a statement of fact, not of moral judgment. Right? But the fact that Israeli humanitarian organizations and political leaders are responding to the accusations of war crimes and the famine that is taking place in Gaza should be a wake-up call to all of us, especially to Israelis. And it's important that we recognize that. Now, this entire circumstance of fighting a war becomes even more complicated from a moral position when we see in recent weeks headlines have been filled with continued reports of Israeli violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, the torching of fields and assaults on farmers, sometimes in full view of security forces. At the same time, we're seeing in Israel members of the Haredi community staging disruptive protests against military conscription, blocking roads, and even ambulances. These are not the acts of the majority of Israel, but they cast a long, terrible shadow. They reveal how extremism, whether driven by ideology or religious absolutism or political opportunism, erodes Israel's moral standing. It deepens its internal divisions and fuels narratives that continue to delegitimize the state. It is in this climate that the image, it's fine. Sherelle, it's fine. He let him act his age, it's okay. It's in this climate that the images of National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir's visit to Marwan Barghouti's prison cell, complete with taunts for the cameras, and that's exactly what he was hoping to do, landed in the public eye. Whatever the provocation, whether the crimes of a convicted terrorist, the aggression of violent settlers, or the disruption caused by extremist protests, Judaism insists, especially in moments in which it is difficult, our tradition insists that we continue to view every human being as created B'Tselem Elohim in the image and likeness of God. The truth obligates us to act with dignity and restraint, even toward those whose actions we oppose most fiercely. Additionally, Rambam's prohibition of cutting down fruit trees in wartime, which we will read in the Torah in a couple of weeks in Parshat Shoftim, is about more than agriculture. It's about setting limits on vengeance so that victory does not poison our soul. The Torah says, V'amarta bilvavecha, you may say in your heart, Kochi v'otzem yedi, my power and strength of my hands, osedli et ha'chayil hazeh, have made this wealth for me. And then it continues, V'zacharta et Adonai Elohecha, and you shall remember the Lord your God. Ki hu hanoten lecha koach la'asot chayil, because it's God who gave you the strength to be victorious, to have the power to prosper. Ramban Nachmanides teaches that the right to the land is not an entitlement of might. It depends on humility before God and fidelity to our moral covenant. Forget that and overreach, whether in policy or in spirit, and that can lead to decline. Earlier this week, former Justice Minister Erwin Kotler, long one of Israel's most eloquent defenders, also called for the war to end. His concern is not rooted in naivete. Anyone who knows him knows that's not the case. It's not rooted in naivete about Hamas, but in fear that Israel's conduct risks eroding its moral standing and continues to fuel its delegitimization. One of our congregants put it to me and some others on our spiritual leadership team this way. Many of us are torn up at the damage being done to Israel and to us by a racist and extremist, self-destructive Israeli government. This isn't meant to explain away irrational anti-Semitism. At the same time, I think it's important that we have to acknowledge that the goal of removing Hamas from ruling and leading Gaza is just. Otherwise, we will be back at this again in 3, 5, 7, 10, 20 years from now, because Hamas has made it abundantly clear that if given the opportunity, they will do it again and again and again and again. Their goal is not to live with peace in Israel. Their goal is to live without Jews and without Israel. And they have proven over and over again how seriously they take that goal. But today, many are asking a serious question. Victory at what cost? To our own values and legitimacy. This is the tension. The necessity of removing Hamas so that Israelis can live free from the threat of massacre, and the necessity of doing so without eroding our own values that make Israel worth defending in the first place. And this struggle is not just on the battlefield in Gaza. It's in our living rooms. This week, I had dinner with another congregant who shared with me that he hasn't spoken to his son in 2 years. His last words to me, he said, were, "I can't talk to someone who supports genocide." No shouting, no slammed door, just silence. Moments like Ben Gvir's visit to prison do not exist in isolation. They become symbols used by critics to confirm the worst and by supporters to avoid uncomfortable truths. And in the diaspora, they can widen the gulf between generations and between fellow Jews, even within our own families. Here in Canada, we do not live under rocket fire, but we are living under rising anti-Semitism. I hear from members whose friendships have ruptured, whose children come home in tears, whose co-workers turn hostile. We have a dual responsibility to stand for Israel's right to defend itself and to wrestle openly with the moral questions that arise from how that defense is conducted. Ekev warns us not to harden our hearts so much in self-defense that we lose the capacity to listen. Even the small mitzvot, the Torah reading reminds us matter. V'haya ekev tishma'un, and it shall be as a result of your listening. Rashi teaches that the word ekev, which means heel, warns against trampling the small mitzvot underfoot. In times of conflict, one of the mitzvot we trample the most is listening, especially to those whose views differ from ours and we find difficult to hear. The Parsha teaches us about the importance of strength with restraint. Rambam teaches, Asur lahashchit ilane ma'achal v'chol hamashchit over below tashchit. Back to the fruit trees that you can't destroy. And anyone who destroys the fruit trees violates a prohibition below tashchit that one shall not destroy. If we must spare an enemy's fruit trees, how much more so must we guard human dignity? Strength is not only about defeating an enemy, it's about refusing to gloat over them. I want Israel to do a better job of opening pathways for humanitarian aid to Gaza. Not because, I want them to do it because it's our values. The argument that, well, no other country in wartime has ever had to do that before is true. If you study military history, you know that. The argument about Hamas stealing food and using that as ammunition to maintain control over its own population and to raise money in order to continue to arm themselves to fight Israel, that's true. And from an international legal perspective and the laws of war, Israel is justified in responding the way it's doing. That doesn't make it morally right. I want Israel to do better because of our values and our Torah that teach us, even in these difficult times, perhaps especially in these difficult times, we cannot lose sight of our morality. Otherwise, who do we become? And does it all become worth it? And finally, The Torah reminds us, and our tradition reminds us, that disagreement can be holy. We've talked about this topic before, machloket l'shem shamayim, an argument for the sake of heaven. In Masechet Eruvin, in the Talmud, I taught this on Tisha B'Av, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagreed on everything for 3 years running. And yet, they made it a point of their children marrying each other. Why? Because Beit Hillel would teach Shammai's view before their own, showing respect before rebuttal. And that's why, according to the halakha, it follows Beit Hillel more than it follows Beit Shammai. Now, what are some practical steps that we can do towards healing? We can listen first and begin with the question, help me to understand how you see it. That's Beit Hillel's model. We can name shared pain at the suffering of innocence, hold both Israeli fear and Palestinian suffering together. They're not mutually exclusive. We can link security and morality, defend Israel while upholding Jewish and democratic values. We can break the silence that some of us are experiencing with love. Don't wait for an agreement to say, I miss you. And we can learn together. We can study Torah and the ethics of war in community. For moral clarity grows in chevruta, with shared learning. Moses warns, Kochi va'otzem yadi, my power, my strength. Power is a gift, but without conscience it erodes the soul. Right now, our heels are heavy with grief, with fear, and with anger. But if we're not careful, they'll trample the very things we most need: our compassion, relationships, our ability to hear each other. Guarding the heel means resisting the temptation to humiliate, to make power a spectacle. Small acts of arrogance can and do echo for generations. Keep thinking about that father. Will he and his son speak again before next Shabbat? Before it's too late? We may not control policy in Jerusalem, but we can decide whether this war will destroy the space between us. My prayer is that we will be the generation that defeats Hamas and refuses to give up on each other, that when the fighting ends, we will have the courage to reach across the silence. May we be strong in hand and in heart, so that our children will speak of us not only as survivors of this moment, but as builders, God willing, of peace, of shalom. Shabbat shalom.